podcast Green Edge, Best in BESS. Episode 9, the EPC Tender, Selecting the Right Contractor. Hello and welcome back to Green Edge Best in BESS, the English edition. I'm Jerzy Kuźmiński, and if you've been following this series, you know that in the last episode we covered NIS2 and cybersecurity obligations in BESS projects, what the directive actually requires, who it applies to, and why getting it wrong is an operational and financial risk, not just a compliance checkbox. Today we move to a topic that sits right at the center of project execution, selecting your EPC contractor. Engineering, procurement, construction, the company that will take your permits, your equipment orders, and your grid connection agreement and turn all of that into a working installation. And just to be very upfront about something before we start, this episode is going to be a little unusual because I've sat on both sides of this table. I've run RFP processes as an advisor to investors, and I've prepared bids and negotiated contracts as a contractor representative. That dual perspective changes how I look at this process, and I think it gives me a somewhat more honest view of what actually matters and what the typical investor guidance on this topic gets wrong. Contractors evaluate you just as much as you evaluate them. The quality of your tender document, the realism of your schedule, the clarity of your scope, all of it sends signals to the market. And the contractors who matter most, the ones with real track records and the financial depth to back a warranty, have enough pipeline that they can afford to walk away from a project that looks like trouble before the first shovel hits the ground. So this episode is partly about how to run a good RFP process, but it's also about how to be a client that the best contractors want to work with. So let's get into it. Before we talk about the selection process, we need to talk about what you're selecting for, because EPC contractor is not a single thing. The scope of what you ask a contractor to deliver has enormous consequences for risk allocation, cost, and how your project will be managed through construction and into operations. There are three main delivery models in the BESS market, and each represents a fundamentally different answer to the question of who takes responsibility for what. The first model is full EPC. The contractor delivers everything: engineering, procurement, and construction, including the BESS equipment itself. You sign one contract, you have one counterparty, and the counterparty is responsible for the complete system, from the battery cells in the containers to the transformers stepping up to the medium voltage grid, and integration is their problem, not yours. The advantages of this model are real. One point of contact, one warranty chain, no finger pointing between a battery supplier and the civil contractor when something in the middle isn't working. And from a financing perspective, banks generally prefer this structure. The accountability is clean, and the due diligence on risk allocation is straightforward. The disadvantage is that you hand over control of a critical decision: which battery supplier goes into your project. The EPC contractor will select based on their commercial relationship and supply chain, not necessarily based on what's optimal for your 15-year operational profile. And if something goes wrong with the batteries under warranty, your path to resolution runs through the EPC, not directly to the manufacturer, which adds a layer of friction you may not want. The second model is BOP, balance of plant. Here you purchase the BESS containers directly from the supplier, and the EPC contractor handles everything else: civil works, electrical infrastructure, MVE connection, integration, and commissioning. This is where you get the most control over equipment selection, potentially significant savings. You're not paying the EPC's margin on the most expensive single component in the project, and you have a direct relationship with the battery manufacturer, which matters for warranty claims and long-term service continuity. But the BOP model comes with a coordination challenge that is real and should not be underestimated, especially if you're executing your first or second BESS project. You now have two contracts, two scopes, and a critical interface between them. Who owns that interface? When the EMS needs to talk to the SCADA, when the protection relay settings need to match the grid connection parameters, when the FAT schedule for the containers needs to align with the site readiness, someone has to manage the coordination. If nobody takes explicit ownership of it, the answer by default is you. And if you don't have the technical depth to do that credibly, you will spend a significant portion of your construction phase managing a dispute between two suppliers who each believe the problem belongs to the other one. We have seen this happen on real projects. The resolution is always expensive and always slower than anyone anticipated. The third model is full wrap EPC with O&M, a single contractor delivering construction and then a multi-year operational and maintenance contract bundled into one agreement. This is increasingly common in Europe, particularly for investors who want cost predictability across the full asset lifecycle and for projects where the bank's requirements for revenue certainty push towards a structure where one party is accountable for both performance and the uptime. The financial logic here is genuine. A contractor who knows they will be servicing the system for 12 or 15 years has a built-in incentive to build it properly in the first place. Every shortcut during construction becomes a service cost during operations. That alignment of incentives is valuable. The trade-off is that you are locking yourself into a long-term relationship, and if the quality of the service deteriorates in year 5, or if the contractor's financial situation changes, exiting a full wrap agreement is significantly more painful than renegotiating a standard O&M contract. Which model fits your situation? Well, that depends on your team's technical depth, your appetite for coordination complexity, and what your financing requires. If you have experienced project management resources and want to optimize cost, BOP with a strong owner's engineer can be a best outcome. If you want simplicity and your bank is setting the terms, full EPC or full wrap gives you the cleanest structure. There is no universally correct answer, but the choice has to be made deliberately before you write your RFP, because everything that flows from it. The question when to issue the RFP. One of the most common mistakes I see in BESS procurement is getting the timing wrong, and the mistake runs in both directions. If you issue the RFP too early, you don't have the information contractors need to price accurately. You don't have your grid connection conditions. You don't have a confirmed equipment specification. You may not even have a building permit. The result is that you receive indicative quotes with large contingency buffers, which tell you relatively little, and you've consumed several weeks of contractor capacity for information you could have gotten from a phone call. If you issue too late, you compress the time available for proper evaluation, negotiation, and contract execution, which typically means either a rash decision or a delayed financial close. Neither is good. For utility-scale standalone projects, I structure the process in 2 distinct phases, and I'd recommend you do the same. The first phase is a preliminary request for information, sometimes called an RFI or a preliminary RFP. You're not asking for binding offers. You're asking for enough pricing intelligence to validate your project economics, understand the market range, and build a shortlist. This can be issued somewhat earlier in the development process. You don't necessarily need a building permit yet, though having your grid connection conditions is important. You can close this phase in approximately 4 weeks, and it gives you the data you need to refine your financial model before committing to further development costs. The second phase is the binding RFP, the process that produces the offer you will actually negotiate into a contract. At this stage, contractors need adequate time to prepare a serious response. From my experience on the contractor side, 3 to 4 weeks is the minimum for a competent team to produce a well-considered offer on a mid-size project. Below that, the offer is either superficial or protected by contingency margins that make it commercially unattractive. After you receive offers, you should plan for 2 weeks of technical clarification meetings where you go back to each contractor, work through the assumptions in their offer, and allow them to sharpen the numbers based on answers to the questions that were ambiguous in the RFP. Then you go to BAFO, best and final offer, and the selection. Total timeline from issuing the binding RFP to signing a contract realistically takes 3 to 5 months, depending on the complexity of the project and the pace of contract negotiation, which is a long time in the development schedule, so plan accordingly. One thing that often surprises foreign investors is how much the timeline is affected by the grid connection process in Poland specifically. Unlike markets where connection conditions are relatively stable and fast to obtain, in Poland the DSO process, and for larger projects the PSC coordination, can introduce uncertainty that makes it difficult to issue a binding RFP until certain milestones are confirmed. If you're not familiar with the specifics of the Polish grid connection process, I've covered it in earlier episodes. I'd recommend episode 4 on UC84 and the broader development context. Now let's get specific. What does a well-constructed RFP actually look like? I'll say upfront that there is no single template that fits every project, but there are structural elements that every binding RFP should contain, and their absence is always costly, either in the quality of the offers you receive or in disputes during execution. The first element is project context: who you are, what you're building, where it is, what the purpose of the installation is. This sounds obvious, but I've received RFPs where none of this was stated clearly, where I had to dig deep into the technical specifications, whether this was a standalone merchant project or a hybrid connected to an existing PV farm. That ambiguity matters for how you scope civil works, for how you assess grid risk, for how you price commissioning. Tell contractors who they're working with and what they're helping you build. The second element is scope definition, and this is where most RFPs fail. What is in the contractor's scope and what is explicitly outside it? Who is responsible for the grid connection agreement, the investor or the contractor? Who manages the DSO interface during construction? Who provides the access road and fencing? Who handles the SCADA integration if the BESS is controlled by a third-party optimizer? Who commissions the protection relay settings in coordination with the network operator? If these questions don't have clear answers in your RFP, every contractor will make different assumptions, and then you will receive offers that appear to differ by 20 or 30%, but are actually quoting entirely different scopes. That comparison is meaningless, and you will spend the next 2 months trying to reconcile it. A scope matrix, a table that lists every element and assigns responsibility clearly, is not optional on a serious project. It takes the time to build, but it saves time later on. The third element is technical documentation. Attach everything you have: the grid connection conditions, site plan with plot boundaries, geotechnical survey if available, equipment specification if you have already selected your battery supplier, any specific requirements from the network operator. The more complete the package, the more accurate the offers. Contractors who receive complete technical packages price more competitively because they don't need to protect themselves against unknowns. The fourth element is schedule requirements. When does construction need to start? When must the installation be commissioned? Are there hard deadlines, grid connection windows, subsidy conditions, capacity market delivery obligations that make certain dates non-negotiable? Say so explicitly. A contractor needs to know whether your milestone dates are aspirational or contractual. The difference in pricing between loose schedule and one with liquidated damages for delay is significant, and that difference needs to be in the offers, not discovered during negotiation. The fifth element is commercial framework: preferred payment structure, performance security requirements, warranty period, whether you have a draft contract that will form the basis of negotiation, and so on. Attach the draft contract if you have one. I know this feels like giving away your negotiating position, but a contractor who doesn't know what risk they're taking on cannot price the risk accurately. The alternative is that they assume worst case and pricing accordingly, or they miss it entirely and you discover the misalignment when you're trying to close the contract. The sixth element is evaluation criteria. Tell contractors how you will score their offers. What weight does price carry? What weight does technical approach, project schedule, reference track record, team qualifications? Being explicit about this is not just fair to contractors. It forces you to decide your own priorities before you're sitting in front of competing offers trying to make a decision under pressure. And it signals to the market that you're running a professional process which influences who takes it seriously. The next element is offer format requirements. Specify the structure you want. Cost breakdowns by major component category, a project schedule in sufficient detail to assess credibility, key personal CVs, reference projects with contact details, a response to the draft contract identifying material comments. Standardization here is essential for comparison. If you allow free form responses, you will receive 10 documents with 10 different structures, and comparison will be a manual exercise that introduces bias. And finally, process and deadlines. Submission date, the point of contact for technical questions, whether there will be a site visit, when you expect to make a decision. Contractors make resource allocation decisions based on this information. Treat it seriously. But now you have your RFP, so who receives it? The answer that comes most naturally to many investors, well, particularly those with corporate procurement backgrounds, is to cast a wide net. More competition, better prices. Send it to 15 companies and let the market sort it out. In my experience, this is wrong for BESS projects, and it produces worse outcomes than a tighter, more curated process. Preparing a credible offer on a BESS project is not a trivial exercise. It requires site analysis, equipment pricing from subcontractors and suppliers, engineering assumptions, risk assessment, and contract review. This is a meaningful investment of time for a serious contractor, easily 40 to 80 hours of qualified staff time. When a contractor receives an RFP alongside 14 other companies, they are doing a calculation. What is my probability of winning? And is the expected return on the effort of preparing a good offer positive? For a large contractor with a healthy order book, the answer is often no. They submit a quick number with wide margins, or they don't submit at all. The contractors who respond enthusiastically to open, wide distribution tenders are not always the ones you want on your project. 4 to 6 contractors is the right range for a binding RFP, enough to give you genuine competition and market rate pricing. Few enough that each participant knows their probability of winning is meaningful, which justifies the effort of a serious offer. Building that shortlist requires active market intelligence. Who has actually completed comparable BESS projects in Poland or in similar markets in Central and Eastern Europe? Not who claims to be active in energy storage. Who has operational reference you can actually call? In Poland, the market for experienced BESS contractors is not as deep as in Germany or the UK, and it is worth being realistic about that. There are companies with strong electrical infrastructure backgrounds, high voltage substations, industrial installations, who have successfully completed 1 or 2 BESS projects and can credibly handle a mid-size standalone. There are also companies who have attended every trade fair, produced an impressive deck about their BESS capabilities, and have no completed project to show for it. For international investors coming to Poland for the first time, the shortlisting step is genuinely difficult without local market knowledge. Knowing who the credible players are, who has the right relationship with DSOs and PSE, who has a track record of getting commissioning done without extended disputes, that knowledge comes from being in the market, not from a LinkedIn search. What to look for at shortlisting stage? Completed projects of comparable scale, stability of ownership and financial position, their own engineering and construction resource rather than a model built entirely on subcontracting, and references that are actual. A company that cannot provide a single live reference contact from a completed project should not make your shortlist. A step that is often skipped or organized at the wrong moment is the site visit, an organized visit to the project location for shortlisted contractors. My recommendation is to hold the site visit after the first round of offers when you have a shortlist of 3 or 4 contractors who have demonstrated that they understand the project and are genuinely competitive. Not before, because a site visit for 20 companies is a logistical waste and gives serious contractors no reason to prepare carefully. The site visit does 2 things. First, it allows contractors to verify their assumptions. In a document, the site plan shows a flat, accessible plot with a clean connection path. On the ground, the access road may be too narrow for oversight transport. The connection route may require working alongside a live medium voltage line. The soil may show signs of water issues that change the foundation design entirely. A contractor who has visited the site prices more accurately because they've seen the actual conditions, and that translates into fewer change orders disputes during construction. Second, the site visit is an evaluation opportunity for you. Watch who attends. A contractor who sends a senior project engineer and asks detailed questions about the grid connection, about the substation arrangement, is way different from the one who sends a junior sales representative who takes 3 photos and leaves in 40 minutes. How a contractor behaves at the site visit is often a reliable preview of how they will behave during construction. For C&I projects, installations at operating industrial facilities, the site visit is not optional, it is essential. The contractor needs to understand the existing electrical infrastructure, identify where the connection to the internal distribution system will sit, assess space constraints, and understand the operational schedule of the facility. Can they work during production? Only in some windows? Only at the weekends? What are the site's safety requirements? These are not questions that have answers in a document. They require someone standing in the facility with the client's technical team. But now you've received your offers. So here comes the part that determines whether the process produces a good outcome or just a number. Let me be direct. Price is one input and not the decision criterion. I know that sounds obvious. I also know that in practice, price is often the deciding factor because it's the easiest thing to compare and the easiest thing to defend to internal governance. But in BESS execution, the cheapest offer is very often the most expensive project. So let me tell you how I would structure the evaluation. Price, but with the composition. Don't compare total contract values. Compare itemized breakdowns. If your RFP required a cost breakdown by category, civil works, electrical infrastructure, NV connection, BESS integration, commissioning, engineering, then you can identify where offers diverge. If one contractor is significantly cheaper in civil works and everyone else is in the same range, either they found a genuinely more efficient approach or they've missed something. The former is worth understanding. The latter will cost you in change orders. Also look at the spread across the full shortlist. If 4 offers cluster between 100 and 110 and one is at 70, that is not a bargain, that is a risk. Either the scope is incomplete, the assumptions are optimistic, or the contingency for project risk has been stripped out to win the bid. Finding out which it is after signing the contract is not a conversation you want to have. Track record and references. Verified, not claimed. So ask for a reference list of completed BESS projects, not projects in progress, not projects under development, projects that have actually been commissioned and are operating. Then call the references, not an email, a phone call, or ideally a site visit. The questions that matter: did the project complete on schedule? Was the final cost within the original budget? How did the contractor handle problems when they arose? Would you award them a second contract? The last question is the most informative. An answer of yes, but tells you considerably more than an hour of presentations. The project team and not the company. So companies bid, but people build. The project manager who will be on your side every week is not the same person as the business development director who presented at the clarification meeting. Before you make your final decision, ask to meet the proposed project manager. Assess whether they understand your project, whether communication is clear and direct, whether they can articulate the risks they see and how they intend to manage them. The relationship with the project manager will define your construction experience more than anything else in the contract. Technical approach and schedule credibility. A good offer doesn't just say what will be built, it describes how. What is the sequencing of civil works and electrical installation? How is the FAT for the battery container scheduled? What are the critical path milestones? A contractor who has thought through the execution logic in this level of details is much more likely to actually manage the project this way than one who submits a generic schedule that was copied from a previous bid. Another part is financial stability. You are entering a relationship that spans 12 to 24 months of active construction and then a warranty period on top of that. A contractor who is financially fragile during the window creates risks that go beyond poor workmanship. If a key subcontractor doesn't get paid, the installation stops. If the contractor enters insolvency mid-project, you may have a half-built installation and a difficult legal situation. Request audited financial statements. Look at the revenue trajectory, working capital, and debt levels. This is not intrusive. It is standard due diligence on a project of this size. Contract posture. Pay attention to how a contractor responds to your draft contract terms. A contractor who accepts every clause without comment has either not read it carefully or is planning to revisit the issue during execution. A contractor who returns a list of 50 comments on a 3-page term sheet may be signaling that they are not willing to take on the responsibilities you need them to accept. What you want to see is a contractor who engages properly with the risk allocation, who identifies the points that genuinely affect their pricing and their ability to perform, proposes reasonable alternatives, and accepts the rest. This is a counterparty who understands the project and is approaching it as a long-term relationship. But let me close this evaluation section with something that most procurement guides don't cover: the warning signals that should cause you to pause, on the contractor side but also on the investor side. A price significantly below all other offers without a clear explanations, promises of an unusually fast schedule without a detailed plan supporting it, no questions following receipt of the RFP, which in a document of any complexity means either they haven't read it or they are not taking it seriously, references that don't respond or that give carefully vague answers, high turnover of the team between the RFP phase and negotiation. Different people at every meeting signals organizational instability or lack of genuine commitment to the project, and pressure on artificial deadlines. This pricing is only valid until Friday. That is a sales tactic. not a project management approach. And some red flags from the investor side, which matters equally because they determine the quality of offers you receive and the contractors who stay engaged. An RFP without grid connection conditions attached, a schedule frame as soon as possible without specific dates, a scope that doesn't define the boundary between investor and contractor responsibility, a process with 20 participants and no explanation of how the selection will be made. These signals tell serious contractors that the project is at an early and uncertain stage, that there will be many changes during execution, and that the investor may not have the internal capacity to manage a construction project efficiently. The contractors who proceed in those conditions are not always the ones you want. And there is one more. And I'll be direct about it because it matters in Poland specifically and in Central and Eastern Europe markets more broadly. An investor who approaches the process with the assumption that the lowest price wins, who doesn't engage seriously with technical proposals, and who signals through their conduct that the relationship will be purely transactional, will attract purely transactional contractors. And in BESS construction, where the complexity and the interface risks are real, a purely transactional contractor is a genuine project risk. But since this podcast is aimed at international investors, it's worth taking a moment to place the Polish EPC market in a European context, because the experience of running a procurement in the UK, Germany or Italy does not translate directly. The Polish market has a smaller pool of contractors with completed BESS experience than Western European markets. Germany and the UK have been running significant BESS deployments for several years longer, and the EPC ecosystems there is correspondingly more developed. In Poland, the first wave of utility-scale BESS projects is commissioning now in 2026, which means the reference base is limited and the supply of genuinely experienced contractors is real constrained. This has two practical implications. First, your shortlisting process needs to be more thorough, not less, because the gap between a credible contractor and one who is learning on your project is harder to identify from the outside. Second, the timeline for finding and qualifying a strong contractor may be longer than you'd expect from experience in more mature markets. Starting the market engagement early, even before the RFP is ready to issue, is worth doing in Poland. There is also language and process dimension. Polish grid operators, both the DSO and PSE, have specific documentation requirements, communication protocols, and approval processes that differ from what contractors are used to in other markets. A contractor who has navigated the Energa or Tauron grid connection process before is solving a different problem from one who has a good general European experience but has never submitted documentation to a Polish DSO. That local familiarity has real value and is worth weighing in your evaluation. But before I wrap up, a quick note on where Greenedge Solutions and ROVA Systems can add value at this stage of your project. At Greenedge Solutions, we support investors through the full procurement process, structuring the RFP, building the contractor shortlist, running the technical evaluation, and sitting across the table during contract negotiation. We've been on both sides of this process enough times that we know where the gap between what's written in an offer and what will actually happen on site tends to appear, and we know how to structure contracts and evaluation frameworks that close those gaps before they become disputes. If you're at the stage where you're preparing to select an EPC contractor and you want support from someone who has done this for projects across the Polish market, write to us or visit our website at greenedgesolutions.com. And if your project is approaching commissioning or you're thinking about what operations and maintenance looks like for the long term, ROVA Systems provides owner's engineering, construction supervision, and 24/7 monitoring and O&M. Having an owner's engineer independent from your EPC contractor during construction is something I genuinely recommend. We'll cover that topic in more depth in a future episode, but the short version is the EPC contractor's interest and yours are not identical, and having an independent technical representative on site changes the dynamic of the construction relationship in meaningful ways. If this episode was useful, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. And if you know someone who's thinking about entering a BESS project, is in the middle of development, or works in this space professionally, send them this episode. The topics we cover here, insurance, the due diligence, the EPC, battery degradation, the balancing market, these are things worth understanding before you're in the middle of a decision and not after. And if you want to go deeper on any of these topics, I'd invite you to the blog at greenedgesolutions.com. We try to cover these subjects there in more detail than the podcast format allows. The article on EPC procurement that this episode was based on is already up. So to close, selecting an EPC contractor is not a procurement exercise with a correct answer at the end of a scoring matrix. It is a decision about which company you are going to trust to execute complex multi-month project on which your financial returns depend for the next 15 or 20 years. The investors who approach it as a relationship, who invest in the quality of the RFP, who visit the site with contractors, who call the references, who assess the team, not just the company, consistently have better construction experiences than those who approach it as a price competition. That's not idealism, it's what the data from completed projects show. Thanks for listening, subscribe, follow, and I'll see you in the next episode. Cześć!